In the late summer of 1876, Jesse James was a man who felt like a god. He had spent a decade outsmarting the most powerful detectives in America. He had survived gunfights, avoided ambushes, and watched as his legend grew with every train he derailed. To the people of Missouri, he was a ghost that couldn't be caught. But inside the mind of Jesse James, a dangerous rot was setting in. It was the rot of overconfidence. Jesse was tired of the brush. He was tired of the dusty backroads of the South. He wanted a score so big and so bold that it would echo all the way to Washington, D.C. He decided to lead his gang nearly 500 miles north into the heart of Minnesota. His target, the First National Bank of Northfield. It was a move that defied every rule of survival the gang had ever followed. They were leaving the territory where every farmer was a friend and entering a land where every citizen was a potential enemy. The journey north was a long, silent march toward a disaster they couldn't yet see. As the 8 men rode through the rolling hills and fertile prairies, the atmosphere began to shift. The warm, familiar air of Missouri was replaced by the crisp, cool breeze of the north. For the younger brothers, Cole, Jim, and Bob, the land felt wrong. The people looked at them differently. They didn't see heroes of the Confederacy. They saw suspicious strangers with expensive horses and cold eyes. Before we follow them into the streets of Northfield, I want to ask you, have you ever had a gut feeling that you were walking into a trap, but you kept going anyway? That's exactly what Cole Younger felt as they crossed the Minnesota border. If you believe that intuition is a real survival tool, let me know in the comments. I want to hear your stories. And if you're ready to see how one man's ego can lead an entire empire to its knees, make sure you're subscribed to Witness of Silence. We're about to pull back the curtain on the greatest failure in outlaw history. Jesse. James ignored the warnings. He ignored the uneasy glances of his men. He was convinced that the Yankees in Minnesota were soft. He believed that the moment they drew their pistols and let out a rebel yell, the townspeople would cower in fear, just as they did in Missouri. He didn't realize that Northfield was a town built by veterans of the Union Army, men who had faced down cannons at Gettysburg and bayonets at Vicksburg. These were not people who scared easily. The gang spent several days scouting the area, moving between small towns and staying in local hotels under false names. They tried to blend in, but they were like wolves trying to act like sheep. Their Missouri-bred horses stood out. Their heavy linen dusters, designed to hide multiple revolvers, were out of place. Every person they spoke to, every shopkeeper they bought supplies from, was subconsciously recording their faces. The Gato wasn't a detective this time. It was an entire community that was slowly waking up to the presence of danger. On the night of September 6th, the gang met in a secluded woods outside of town to finalize the plan. The air was thick with tension. Cole Younger, usually the most level-headed of the group, argued for caution. He suggested they turn back, but Jesse's charisma was a weapon in itself. He mocked their fear. He painted a picture of a vault overflowing with gold and a town that would be too paralyzed to fight back. He sold them a dream of a perfect heist, but he was leading them into a slaughterhouse. Imagine the last night of peace these men would ever know. They sat around a small fire, cleaning their weapons, checking their saddles, and dreaming of the riches that awaited them in the morning. They thought they were the hunters. They thought they were the masters of the frontier. They had no idea that by the same time tomorrow, 2 of them would be dead in the dirt, and the rest would be bleeding, broken, and running for their lives through a landscape that wanted them dead. The stage was set, the bank was waiting, and the people of Northfield were about to show the James Younger gang that out in the real world, the legend of the Robin Hood of the West didn't mean a thing when a citizen was holding a loaded rifle. Stay with us, because the next 7 minutes of this story are the most violent, chaotic, and revealing minutes in the history of the American frontier. We are about to walk through the doors of the First National Bank, where a simple no from a brave man would start a war that Jesse James couldn't win. If you're hooked on this countdown to chaos, hit that like button right now. It lets us know you're ready for the explosion. In the next chapter, the first shot is fired, and the myth of invincibility is shattered forever. The sun rose over Northfield on September 7, 1876, with a deceptive calm. The air was cool, the streets were beginning to stir with the sounds of daily commerce, and the citizens had no reason to suspect that the most famous killers in the country were currently adjusting their gun belts on the outskirts of town. Jesse James had split his team into 3 groups. It was a classic military maneuver designed to control the street, the entrance, and the getaway path. But the moment they crossed the bridge into town, the ghosts became flesh and blood. The plan was for Jesse, Frank James, and Bob Younger to enter the First National Bank, while the others patrolled the intersection to keep the crowds back. As the 3 men dismounted and walked through the heavy wooden doors, they tried to look like businessmen. But Northfield was a tight-knit community. People noticed the way they moved, with a coiled, predatory energy that didn't match the peaceful morning. Inside the bank, the atmosphere turned frozen in an instant. There were 3 employees: Joseph Lee Haywood, Alonzo Bunker, and Frank Wilcox. Jesse didn't waste time with pleasantries. He vaulted over the counter, brandishing a heavy revolver, and shouted, "Throw up your hands, for we are going to rob the bank." He demanded that Haywood open the safe. This is the moment where the legend of Jesse James met a force he didn't understand. Joseph Haywood wasn't a gunman, but he was a man of ironclad integrity. He knew the safe's time lock hadn't been set, but he looked Jesse James in the eye and lied. He told him it was locked and couldn't be opened. Even as Jesse pressed a cold knife to his throat and fired a warning shot past his ear that shattered the man's eardrum, Haywood didn't flinch. He chose death over betraying the trust of the people whose money he guarded. While the drama unfolded inside, the disaster was beginning outside. A local merchant named J.S. Allen tried to enter the bank to do business. One of the outlaws guarding the door, Clell Miller, grabbed him and told him to stand back. Allen didn't panic. He broke away and ran down the sidewalk, his voice ringing out like a bell of doom. "Get your guns! Boys, they're robbing the bank!" The outlaws on the street, Cole and Jim Younger, Bill Chadwell and Clell Miller, began riding their horses in circles, firing their pistols into the air and screaming for people to get off the streets. In Missouri, this tactic always worked. People would dive for cover and stay there. But Northfield was different. These people weren't afraid of the rebel yell. What happened next was a spontaneous, community-wide counterattack. Hardware store owners began handing out rifles and ammunition to anyone who could shoot. Citizens who didn't have guns climbed to second-story windows and began throwing heavy rocks and crates at the outlaws. Within minutes, the hunters had become the targets. Think about the sheer chaos of that scene, the sound of hundreds of glass windows shattering, the smell of black powder filling the narrow street. The outlaws were trapped in a crossfire from people they couldn't even see. Every window was a sniper's nest. Every doorway was a barricade. If you were a citizen in Northfield that day, seeing your quiet town turned into a battlefield, would you have picked up a gun or stayed under your bed? The courage of these ordinary people is what makes this story incredible. If you think the citizens of Northfield are the true heroes of the West, drop a Northfield strong in the comments. And if you're gripping your seat right now, hit that like button to support the channel. The first of the gang to fall was Nicholas Gustafsson, a Swedish immigrant who didn't understand English and didn't realize he needed to run. But soon, the outlaws began to bleed. A local sharpshooter named Henry Wheeler, a medical student with an old army carbine, took aim from a hotel window. He pulled the trigger, and Clell Miller dropped from his horse dead before his boots left the stirrups. Another citizen, A.R. Manning, took aim at Bill Chadwell. One shot through the heart, and the gang's best scout was gone. Inside the bank, Jesse heard the slaughter happening outside. He realized the vault wouldn't be opened and the town was rising up to kill them. In a final, senseless act of spite, he turned to the brave cashier, Joseph Haywood, and shot him point-blank in the head. The 3 men scrambled out of the bank into a literal wall of lead. Cole Younger was already hit multiple times. His face was a mask of blood. As they climbed onto their horses, the gang looked around and saw a sight they never thought possible. Their friends were dead in the dirt. The street was a gauntlet of fire and they had exactly $0 to show for it. The 7 minutes of hell were over. But the nightmare was just starting. They managed to gallop out of town, leaving a trail of blood behind them. But behind them, the largest manhunt in American history was already mobilizing. Over 1,000 men were being deputized. The telegraph wires were screaming their descriptions to every town in the territory. Jesse. James had come to Minnesota to prove he was a god. He was leaving as a wounded animal, and the Gato was no longer just one detective. It was an entire state that wanted his head. Stay tuned. In the next chapter, we follow the harrowing 2-week escape through the swamps and the rain, where the brotherhood of the James Younger gang finally reaches its breaking point. You won't want to miss the moment Jesse has to choose between his friends and his own survival. The hunt is on, and the silence is about to be broken. O Gemini Dees, the streets of Northfield were still ringing with the echoes of gunfire as the survivors of the James Younger gang pushed their horses to the absolute limit. They had entered the town as kings of the frontier. They left it as shattered men clinging to their saddles with blood-slicked hands. Behind them lay 2 of their brothers and the broken body of a brave cashier. Ahead of them lay 400 miles of enemy territory, a landscape that was rapidly turning into a giant, inescapable trap. The Great Escape was not a heroic gallop across the plains. It was a slow, agonizing crawl through the mud. A relentless rain began to fall, turning the Minnesota soil into a thick gray paste that threatened to swallow their horses' hooves. The gang was decimated. Cole Younger was carrying 11 bullet wounds. His brother Jim's jaw had been shattered by a slug. Every mile was a victory against death, but the clock was ticking. The Gato was no longer just a shadow in Chicago. It was a mobilization of fury. Within hours of the raid, the governor of Minnesota had called for every able-bodied man to join the chase. A 1,000-man posse was formed, the largest in the history of the United States. Telegraph operators worked through the night, sending out a digital web of descriptions that moved faster than any horse could run. For the first time in his life, Jesse James wasn't just being followed. He was being surrounded. Imagine the psychological toll of that flight. You are exhausted, starving and soaked to the bone. Every time you see a flickering light in a farmhouse window, you don't see a place to rest. You see a man with a rifle waiting to collect the price on your head. This is the moment where the brotherhood began to rot. The bond that had survived the Civil War and a decade of crime was about to snap under the weight of one question: who is holding us back? Before we witness the moment the gang split in 2, I want to hear from you. In a life-or-death situation, would you stay behind with your wounded friends, or would you leave them to save yourself? It's a brutal question, but it's the one that defined the end of this gang. Tell me your thoughts in the comments. And if you're finding this journey into the collapse of the James Younger legend as intense as I am, make sure you're subscribed to Witness of Silence. We're about to see the true face of Jesse James. By the time the gang reached the outskirts of the big woods, the tension between Jesse and the Youngers reached a breaking point. Jesse James was a pragmatist of the coldest kind. He looked at the younger brothers, bleeding, slowing down the group, and making it impossible to move fast enough to outrun the posse. Jesse suggested a solution that chilled the blood of his companions. He suggested they leave the wounded behind, or worse, put them out of their misery, so the healthy could survive. Cole Younger, a man who had bled for Jesse for years, looked at him with a new kind of horror. He refused. He told Jesse that he would stay with his brothers until the end. This was the moment the James Younger gang died. Not from a bullet, but from a betrayal of the heart. Jesse and Frank James, realizing they couldn't convince the Youngers to abandon their loyalty, decided to abandon them instead. Under the cover of a storm, the brothers split. Jesse and Frank rode west, toward the safety of the Dakota Territory, leaving their oldest allies to face the music alone. It was a cold, calculated move that would follow Jesse's reputation for the rest of his life. He was no longer the leader who stood by his men. He was the survivor who looked out only for himself. The younger brothers were now on foot, their horses exhausted and dead. They crawled through the swamps of Medelia, living on raw corn and stagnant water, hiding in the tall grass as the posse's lanterns passed just feet away. They were hunted like animals, their bodies failing them, their ammunition running low. They were heading toward a final, desperate stand in a place where there was nowhere left to run. But while the Youngers were being cornered, Jesse and Frank were facing their own hell. They were forced to steal horses, kill innocent people who recognized them, and live like wolves. The Gato was closing in on both groups, and the trap was about to snap shut. Stay with us. In the next chapter, we reach the swamp of Madelia, the final bloody stand where the Younger brothers would face a wall of fire, and we'll see how Jesse James managed the impossible escape that kept his legend alive for just a few more years. The blood trail is nearing its end, and the silence is about to become permanent. The rain did not stop. For the Younger brothers, the world had shrunk to the size of a muddy ditch in the Wharton River bottom, near the town of Madelia. This was the end of the road. On September 21st, 1876, 2 weeks after the disaster at Northfield, the Gato finally caught the Rato, but it wasn't a clean capture. It was a massacre in the tall grass. The Younger brothers, Cole, Jim, and Bob, along with the remaining gang member Charlie Pitts, were cornered in a swampy thicket. A volunteer posse of 7 men, led by a local sheriff, had tracked them through the muck. The lawmen didn't call for a surrender from a distance. They moved in through the brush, rifles leveled, hearts pounding. They knew they were hunting the most dangerous men in the sea country, and they weren't taking any chances. The air in the swamp exploded with lead. Charlie Pitts, the man who had stayed loyal when the James brothers fled, took a bullet to the chest and died in the mud. The Youngers, already ravaged by their wounds from Northfield, were hit again and again. Cole Younger, who had already survived more lead than any human should, was struck in the eye and the shoulder. Jim's jaw was shattered once more. It was a scene of visceral, uncompromising violence. When the smoke cleared, the Youngers were still breathing, but their war was over. They were captured, shackled, and hauled off to a Minnesota prison where they would spend the next quarter-century reflecting on the man who had left them behind. But where were Jesse and Frank? While their friends were being shot to pieces in a swamp, the James brothers were performing a vanishing act that seemed almost supernatural. By the time the Youngers were being photographed in their prison stripes, Jesse and Frank were hundreds of miles away. They had stolen horses, avoided every roadblock, and eventually slipped into the Dakota Territory. They had survived, but at a cost that no one else could see. Before we look at the psychological wreckage Jesse carried back to Missouri, I want to ask you, does survival justify betrayal? Jesse James was alive, but he had traded his honor and his oldest friends to stay that way. Is a legend still a legend if it's built on the backs of abandoned brothers? I want to see your takes in the comments. This is where the Robin Hood myth starts to fall apart, and if you're ready for the final chapter of this series, make sure you've liked this video. It tells the algorithm that the world still wants to hear the cold, hard truth. The Northfield raid was more than a failed robbery. It was a psychological decapitation. Jesse James returned to Missouri, but the man who came back wasn't the same man who had ridden north. The charismatic leader was gone, replaced by a man consumed by a terrifying, vibrating paranoia. He couldn't trust his neighbors. He couldn't trust new recruits. He even began to look at his own brother, Frank, with suspicion. He retreated into the deepest shadows of the Little Dixie region. He changed his name, moved his family from house to house under the cover of night, and kept his revolvers within reach, even while he ate. He was a king without a kingdom. The gang was gone, the money was gone, and the eye that never sleeps. The Pinkertons were still out there waiting for him to make one more mistake. The Northfield disaster had proven that the world was changing. The frontier was closing. The era where a man could solve his problems with a fast horse and a .44 caliber revolver was being replaced by the era of the telegraph, the railroad, and the unified law. Jesse James was a relic of a bloodier time, a ghost trying to live in a world that had moved on without him. But the ghost wasn't done yet. Jesse would spend the next few years trying to rebuild, trying to find men he could trust, trying to recapture the glory of his youth. But every man he recruited was a potential Robert Ford. Every handshake was a potential trap. The blood trail that started in the streets of Northfield didn't end in the Minnesota mud. It led all the way to a small house in St. Joseph and a picture on the wall that needed straightening. Stay with us for the final chapter of this episode. We're going to look at the aftermath of the Northfield raid, the ultimate fate of the younger brothers, and how Jesse's desperate attempt to restart his gang led him directly into the arms of the man who would finally end him. The story is nearing its climax, and the silence is about to become deafening. Make sure you've subscribed and turned on that notification bell. The final piece of the puzzle is coming up next. The legacy of the Northfield raid didn't end with the clinking of prison cell doors or the burying of the dead in the Minnesota soil. It settled over the American West like a cold, suffocating fog. In a single afternoon, the myth of the invincible outlaw had been dismantled, not by a legendary lawman, but by the collective will of a town that refused to be victims. For the rest of the world, Northfield became a symbol of civil courage, but for Jesse James, it was the beginning of a long, slow funeral. The younger brothers, once the fiercest warriors of the Missouri brush, were now numbers in the Minnesota State Prison. Cole, Jim, and Bob Younger had survived the war, survived a dozen shootouts, and survived the blood trail through the swamps, but they couldn't survive the silence of a stone cell. They would spend the next 25 years behind bars. Cole Younger, a man who once commanded fear with a single look, would spend his days working in the prison library and the greenhouse, his body a map of scars and old lead. He never spoke a word of hatred toward Jesse for abandoning them, but the silence between the former friends spoke louder than any shout. Back in Missouri, Jesse was living in a nightmare of his own making. He was free, but his freedom was a prison of its own. He became a man who lived in the corners of rooms. He grew a beard, wore glasses, and moved his family in the dead of night, constantly looking over his shoulder for the face of a friend turned traitor. The Northfield disaster had taught him one brutal lesson. Lealtad was a luxury he could no longer afford. He stopped trusting the veterans and started recruiting green boys, young men who were more interested in his fame than his cause, men like the Ford brothers. Before we conclude this chapter of the saga, I want to leave you with a thought. History often remembers the names of the killers, but it forgets the names of the people who stopped them. Joseph Haywood, the cashier who died for a lie. Henry Wheeler, the medical student who picked up a rifle. J.S. Allen, the merchant who sounded the alarm. They were the real gatos who caught the ratto. If you think these ordinary citizens deserve to be remembered more than the outlaws, hit that like button to honor their memory. The Northfield raid changed the American landscape forever. It proved that the law wasn't just a badge or a distant government in Washington. It was a community of people standing together. It forced the Pinkertons to modernize, it forced the railroads to tighten their security, and it forced Jesse James into a corner that he would never truly escape. The blood trail was a circle, and it was slowly closing in on a small house in St. Joseph, Missouri. Jesse James would try to rob again. He would try to build a new gang, a new legend, and a new life. But the fire was gone. The men who had fought by his side in the war were gone. He was a ghost, wandering through a world that was becoming too bright, too fast, and too organized for a man of the shadows. The era of the outlaw was ending, and the era of the coward was about to begin. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the massacre of Northfield. This is just one piece of the puzzle we are piecing together here at Witness of Silence. We don't just tell you what happened, we show you why it still matters. What happens when a man who has lost everything tries to take it all back? In our next episode, we witness the final act of the drama, the betrayal that defined a century and the shot that turned a murderer into a god of the frontier. You won't want to miss the inside man, the treachery of Robert Ford. Click the video on your screen now to see how the hunt finally reached its bloody conclusion. The trail is almost at an end, but the secrets are still buried deep. Subscribe, turn on your notifications, and stay with us, because the silence is where the truth lives.